I'm sure you probably noticed that there is so much content out there on essential leadership traits and skills, and that after a while, all these blogs and videos and podcasts, they all start to sound pretty similar. I mean, it's just like a different rendition of you have to have integrity, you must delegate, and don't forget to communicate with confidence. And while these traits are very important, yes, they're also kind of obvious, right? I mean, seriously, would it make sense for an effective team leader to be dishonest or to do all the work themselves or to communicate in whispers? Of course not. That would be silly. But what if I told you that some of the most powerful traits barely even make some of these lists, and that acquiring them is not only just possible for you, but if you acquire them, you can absolutely increase the impact that you make as a manager this year? Yep, I got you. That's why in today's video, I'm going to unpack for you 3 traits that the most impactful leaders share that basically nobody is talking about, how to know if you possess these traits, and practical steps that even brand new managers can take to start developing these traits that will completely blow the lid off of the impact that you can make in your role on your team as well as on their performance. Oh, and you will want to stick around till the last point, because that third one, I'm telling you, is something that will definitely surprise you. So I had an NMA student, let's call her Jennifer, who was assigned with a really important project that she was going to lead and manage. And so because of the fact that she knew this project was really important and needed to be solved ASAP, she didn't want to make any costly mistakes, which of course is understandable. So she leaned on the voices of many for input. So what happened? How did this turn out for Jennifer? Well, 3 months later, she turned around and she realized she didn't actually even solve the problem. In fact, she was still gathering inputs from many people. And at this 3-month mark, her manager had a one-on-one with her and expressed her disappointment in Jennifer. She said, listen, you knew that this was a really important project. That's why we put you as head of this, and you allowed it to stagnate. What happened? Well, in their conversation, Jennifer had to admit that the reason why she didn't take action was because she still felt like she didn't have all the information that she needed to take the next step. Jennifer's delays were really costly, not just to the objective or the outcome, but also to her reputation. Now, Jennifer's example might be an extreme one, but at the core, this inability or unwillingness to make a decision is a really common challenge and can show up in so many different ways. In fact, I want to share with you a couple of other examples that will help you figure out whether or not you are allowing indecisiveness to hold you back from being able to make the impact you want to make. How many times have you found yourself afraid to make a decision because it's an important one that affects a lot of people like yourself, your team, and the department? Or how many times have you found yourself saying, well, maybe, I don't know, or looking for delays so that you don't need to make a decision because you're afraid that someone will blame you if you make the wrong one? Or how many times have you found yourself relying on a lot of other experts maybe to give you a lot of inputs before you take action? Or how many times have you found yourself relying on the kind of democratic approach so you can gather as much information as possible from all different places before you take action? Here's the thing. Work is a constant process of solving problems, and you as a manager, you are expected to solve complex problems where some of the variables are unknown or ambiguous. And so know that if you are stuck in this hamster wheel of indecision, which by the way is still a decision, know that you are actually not solving problems, but rather creating them. And you're creating problems because now you're going to have a frustrated team, and you are going to actually increase risk to the objective or the outcome that you're trying to achieve. This is why being decisive is at the core of being a nimble and impactful leader. And it's the managers who do this, who are able to demonstrate this in their capacity, in their leadership capacity. That's why they're the ones that are able to stand out in a crowd and earn the respect of their managers. Now, it's not just about being decisive, it's also about being timely. So it's a combination of making wise decisions in a timely manner, which requires that you are taking calculated risks and small actions. Which brings me to the next point, or I think would be the next logical question to ask, which is, well, what happens, Mac, when I make a decision, but things don't play out the way that I intended or had hoped for? What do I do then? Now, before I dive into that, to answer that question, I want us to do a little bit of a self-assessment. And if you have a pen and paper with you, then I encourage you to pull that out and journal this out as I'm asking you these questions. So the first question is, how often do you find yourself lost or overwhelmed in meetings and not being able to keep up with the details of projects that you are responsible for? How often do you find yourself surprised and frustrated with the start and stop nature of business? And finally, how often do you find yourself looking at changes as a complete waste of time rather than looking at them as new opportunities? Now, if you found yourself nodding along to any of those points that I just surfaced, then keep watching because it's all related to the next point or the next trait that I'm going to unpack. So something that I've observed is that a lot of leaders really attach the idea of success to mean that you have to make a plan and see it through to completion exactly the way that it was laid out. And I think the reason this happens is because there is fear underneath the surface around having to deal with the unintended consequences of veering off path. So instead of having to deal with those consequences or having to figure out how to deal with this way, people get really locked into the exact way that they planned, which of course is understandable. But the truth is, change is inevitable. Change is inevitable. The original plan is not always going to work, and it's really important for you as a manager to recognize when your plan requires a change. And then what you got to do is jump right into action and prepare yourself mentally and emotionally to be able to make that pivot. Because if you don't, it is very, very damaging to, of course, the outcome, to your team, and to your reputation, because you end up losing the respect of those around you if you cannot be nimble and adapt to change. You know what I find really interesting about this is that the better you become at adapting to change, the more timely and effective decisions you end up making with less than perfect information, which, by the way, is a twofer for becoming a top-tier leader and manager. So now, of course, the question is, well, how do I become more adaptable, Mac? Well, it really lies in being able to adapt your thinking and your approach by always thinking about alternative routes and actions that you can think, as well as really thinking through the inconsistencies by doing a couple of things. And this is where you'll want to pull out that notepad again and just jot down some of these notes because I think this is important. So you want to reconcile the inconsistencies by thinking through potential adverse outcomes early and often while constantly thinking on your feet. You also want to stay engaged as much as possible in the project you're being assigned from start to finish. And most importantly, you want to embrace change with a positive mindset and learn to keep your emotions under control. This one is super important. Never, ever underestimate the power of your attitude on your team members. Guaranteed, if you have a negative, kind of mindset or feeling or tone, I should say, about the change or the pivot that's needed, then your team will oftentimes reflect that as well. So you got to get your own mindset, approach, and just way of being under control in order to help them make that pivot and be positive as well with you. As you can probably tell, improving your ability to adapt to change is really about your mindset. However, you also need to have the situational skills to back that up, which is exactly what we discuss in the New Manager Accelerator program. And so I will drop the link for you in the description box below if you want to learn more. But for now, let's keep going. So as you can probably see by now, being adaptable, which is our second trait, goes a long way to helping you make effective decisions, which was our first trait. But here's the thing, y'all. Even if you make great decisions and you're super adaptable, you can be in a position where you have a resistant team. Maybe they're stuck in their ways and they don't want to veer off path, even though you know the best way to go is this way. What do, right? Well, this is where having that ability or skill set to take them on course with you comes into play, which is our third trait that, by the way, I hardly ever hear come up in blogs or videos or podcasts. Now, before we dive into the third trait, I want you to give me a thumbs up if what I'm about to share is something that you have heard before. A rabbit and turtle were in the race. The rabbit launched out of the gates full speed with a huge burst of energy and immediately accelerated to full speed. On the other hand, the turtle stuck his head out of his shell and took one or two lumbering steps. As the race proceeded, the rabbit quickly ran out of steam and collapsed. A few minutes later, the turtle caught up with the rabbit and passed him, eventually winning the race by plodding along consistently. Now, most of us are very familiar with stories like this that often have some sort of moral. And in this case, the moral of the story was slow and steady wins the race. Now, maybe you're rolling your eyes and shaking your head and saying to yourself, really, Mac, this is the big juicy trait that you wanted to talk to me about, which it is not. This is not the trait. However, why do you think I told you this story? Well, for most of us, we were raised surrounded by stories like this that were told through books, through our teachers, and also a lot of times through our parents. And most of these stories were told in order to help us to shape our beliefs that we have in the world, to help us understand the world around us, and they were also really memorable. So what does this have to do with leadership? Well, I'm going to share with you 2 different examples of how to communicate a very simple concept, and you let me know which one you think is more effective. Number 1. So my expectation is that you communicate with me upfront if you're not going to be able to meet my deadline. Number 2. When I was growing up, my mom had a very simple rule with me, which was, if you're going to be late, Mac, from coming home from wherever you are, please make sure you call me so that I don't worry. Well, one night I went out and I was partying with my friends and I allowed the cell phone battery to die on my cell phone, and I didn't get a chance to call my mom. And so, of course, because I was young and immature at the time, I didn't really think to borrow somebody else's, phone to call her. Instead, I just went home thinking everything was going to be okay. Well, I rolled up to the door and sure enough, there were police officers there who were very concerned for my well-being, including my mom. She had tears in her eyes and she was like, Mac, where were you? I was so worried that something terrible happened to you. Now, of course, I explained what happened, but I got to tell you, it took some time before she can really trust me, and I actually ended up getting grounded for a whole month. What this experience taught me is that it's better for me, even if I'm a little bit afraid, to communicate up front because it will reduce worry and anxiety later. So because of this, I really carry this principle with me in my personal life as well as in my professional life, which is why I ask all my team members that if you don't feel like you're going to be able to deliver something on time, instead of holding silence, I want you to communicate with me, because the silence actually creates worry, which breaks down the trust that we have. So communicate up front to reduce chaos later. Let me ask you, which one do you think the team member will really remember? Which one makes the point? Which one will allow or help the team member understand what my expectations are and why I have these expectations? Do you see how storytelling is such a powerful tool that you can use to educate someone, to motivate someone, to empower someone, and also to excite their interest in what you are asking them to do? Awesome leaders, y'all, collect stories. And they communicate these stories as often as possible, and they relate it to their team members. So for example, you might lead a customer support team, and maybe you're sitting there thinking, well, Mac, what possible stories can I tell? Well, you have stories that you can tell. Because for example, every single customer support team needs to communicate with empathy, with active listening and understanding, right? And so what you can do, for example, with a customer service department is to share stories from the customer's viewpoint to help team members understand the emotions and the frustrations that the customer faces, which builds in your team member more patience and understanding. Storytelling is a powerful tool that not enough leaders are using. Let me tell you that for sure. So how do you know whether or not you are utilizing storytelling in your work? Well, here's a quick self-assessment that will surface some signs that you are not using storytelling like you should. So pull out that pen and paper and let's reflect together. Number 1, you will know you are not using storytelling to your advantage if you find yourself repeating instructions, guidance, and advice to your team members over and over again. You will know you are not utilizing storytelling if team members don't seem to grasp the implications of their actions. Or maybe your team members don't understand the why behind the what. So because of that, they resist change and lack the ability to adapt to the dynamics of the work environment. And lastly, maybe you're not using storytelling to your advantage if team members don't see the bigger picture in terms of their day-to-day activities or their professional development. So let me ask you, how did you do? Like all the other traits that I described today, decision-making, adapting to change, storytelling is also a one that you can absolutely learn. You can acquire this skill. It's not something that all of us are born with. Yes, some people have this natural talent, but it's something that we all need to acquire. Now, maybe you're sitting there thinking to yourself, really, Mac, I did not need yet another thing that I needed to work on. But let me tell you, the better you get at storytelling, the easier it is for you to get and achieve the outcomes that you want. So if you work on that, then it makes it easier for you on the back, like on the back end. So I want to encourage you to work on those skill set, on this specific skill set. Now, I'm sure you noticed that the traits that we considered today are kind of subtle and nuanced. And that's because of the fact that I've always felt like these specific traits are like subtext. It's like the secret sauce that you have in order to really be impactful. It just makes the meal that you are creating that much tastier. That being said, though, no matter how much sauce you drown your meal in, it is not going to help if the main ingredients are not quality. Which is why, in order to have the full recipe, I want to encourage you to watch this video right here, where I'll talk about the foundational leadership traits that you must possess if you want to be an impactful leader rather than a mediocre leader.